Good afternoon. Such a great honor to be here at the Swedish House of Finance, and also such an honor to speak after Professor Luigi Zingalis, from whom I took the classes 27 years ago. And I still remember every lecture was just such a strong dose, that's so strong you have for the full day. And Luigi really haven't changed after almost 30 years. So today I'm going to talk about board diversity. It's a joint work with Slava Force and Huashen Nie. One was my former, actually both of my were my former students. And this is a very US-based, it's a US-based study, but I think the topic is very global. And this, my understanding, is much discussed in Europe. And I also believe there are many unique and different perspectives in Europe, which I look forward to learning more. And this is going to be a very fact and empirical based. I'm actually not trying to form my own narrative, but based on the data and evidence that I will present, and I'm sure different people could form different opinions and views, and that will invite some diversity of views on its own. Okay. Now, and with this audience, I don't have to motivate why boards are important for the governance as well as success, short-term and long-term, of the company, because boards are entrusted with the job of overseeing the company, deciding strategy and long-term direction of the corporations. Now, why do we want board diversity? So this is something I can think about at a very intuitive and natural point. A typical board has 8 to 10 people. Now, if everybody is a replica of someone else, what's the point of having 8 to 10 people? Now, until quite recently, historically, when we look into historical data of US boards, people tend to agree they were not diverse, predominantly occupied by white male. That's what people first observe. But actually, it's more than that. Not only it's about the demographic characteristics, but also these people tend to graduate from the same college and join the same country club. So I think the fact that they were being white male is just a proxy of something that is more multidimensional about lack of diversity. So from economic perspective, we want in a decision-making body, everybody somehow draw independent signal, right? And when you aggregate those independent signals, you reach an informed decision that is also robust. If people come to the room with the same view, same opinion, then occasionally you can make a very correct decision, but that decision cannot be robust given the dynamically changing landscape and society. So this is what we think about diversity. Now, is diversity unconditionally good, desirable? Is it something we want to pursue as an ultimate metric, as objective? No, I don't quite disagree. I don't quite agree, okay? So I think it's more nuanced. In some terms, right, biodiversity, diversified portfolio, we think diversity is good, but diversity per se is also variance or dispersion. Now, we are finance people, and we know oftentimes variance belongs to the denominator of a metric we try to maximize. Okay, so it is more nuanced. So there is some intuitive thoughts. We want to pursue diversity just for the sake of having informed, robust decision-making because we need to aggregate very diverse, independent signals. Now, sometimes people can also argue diversity along some dimension could be its own objective. So, for example, in the US, I think many other places as well, demographic diversity is a metric measured to measure the success of a company's senior leadership on a board. Now, why that? We can take that into consideration of historical perspective. If, for historical reasons, there are certain marginalized groups, and this group will be disfranchised and feel there's no point of working hard or being motivated because there's no position for someone like me. Now, if every member of every group see people who look like them at the upper echelon of society, and they will see this society is inclusive, that will give them the motivation to put in the effort, seeking the right path to work forward. So this could justify of pursuing those diversity at its own objective. Now, The third one, I would think there's some combined view or somewhere in the middle ground. That both make sense, but if you think about the success of a company is to penetrate the widest possible market and stakeholders. You want to market for the global market full of people of all kinds, okay? And you want to recruit talents just based on talent, based on skills and experience themselves and not worry about anything else in order for the company to be appealing for talents from all social groups and backgrounds, then a diversity of the board would set up the tone. Now, I don't claim that one needs to be a member of a certain group in order to understand their group well. So for example, I have many guy friends who seem to understand what women want better than I do. Okay, so however, on average, one's background and demographic attributes are a powerful proxy for what they understand and what they can bring to the table. So I think I view those as a powerful proxy, okay, and probably holds on average and at large. Okay. So what I want to talk about that is already something you already have heard many, many times over. So there is a large literature on board diversity, but has predominantly focused on demographic attributes, okay? And that is understandable because these are the most measurable and what people would go after when we have this social goal as a first step. So for example, okay, the big three, which is the three largest asset managers, which Luigi mentioned multiple times in his speech, the big three campaigns on gender diversity of corporate boards because they hold such powerful votes, then corporations, even without a formal quota system, would try to promote board diversity so that they could get favorable votes for these most powerful institutional investors. There are also some regulation mandated quota. For example, the California state in 2018 imposed a gender quota for all firms headquartered in California. That law was later revoked. But the NASDAQ board diversity rule in 2022 is still in place. So NASDAQ rule basically say you either have a certain minimum number of diverse directors that defined by both gender, race, and also a sexual orientation. Okay, and if the company does not meet the criterion, it doesn't say they are forced to, but they must explain. So it's comply or explain rule. Okay, now what we try to emphasize is that the concept of diversity should be diverse. If we want to embrace diversity, then we should not have one view of diversity. That's what we try to emphasize. Okay, so let's just try to put a diverse set of diversity rules in one place and see how they have evolved over time. And do they come with some trade-off with one versus the other? How are they impacted the corporate alignment in our contemporary time? Okay, and one thing I want to point out, which is sometimes when you do research, you kind of find what you expect. But there's one thing we found that's completely to our own surprise as researchers is what I call the partisan realignment. Now this could be a very U.S. centric pattern. Is that historically the U.S. corporation senior executives, what corporations represent, tend to be more aligned with the conservative view or the Republican Party. It's not necessarily partisan, but more pro-Republican Party. But during the past decade, okay, the corporate, if you read about corporate, not people, but corporations have views, and those views tend to emerge the headline of news media, and you will see those views more and more tend to be aligned with the progressive views, and if you have to ask them to choose a party, they will probably choose the Democratic Party. So from the political scientists, they call it partisan realignment. And we actually find a mechanism why this partisan realignment is happening. Okay? And finally, we have an event study say, hey, the COVID is something just happened. Nobody anticipated. So this is a perfect, what we call a shock. And during the shock, we can see which diversity matter, okay, for the board composition. Okay. So let me introduce a little bit about data source, but I will not go into detail. But I just want to brag, in a way to brag about, because this is the most comprehensive database of individual directors that have been composed so far, because we try to combine 3 leading corporate board databases supplemented by textual analysis and manual collection. So we are combining the BoardX, the Aquila, and the ISS. The reason we want to combine all 3 is that we really need to get into a lot of personal information, like the gender, race, and also the whole history of the employment, the education, so that we can measure diversity from many different dimensions. Okay? So these 3 databases, if I have a Venn diagram, they look like this. So there's overlap, but there's also a lot of non-overlap. Now, BoardX is a very comprehensive database, but it contains the least information. It has a very sketchy bio of individual directors. You don't know their race or gender you can infer, but you don't have race, don't have their detailed bio. So when we compose all 3 databases, consolidate firms looking like the right panel. So increased dramatically to about the early 2010s, and right now it's been very stable. Now, in the US, there are currently about slightly over 4,000 public listed firms, and this database will capture a great majority. And if you measure by market cap, it's pretty much captured by all, because the top 500 is already 3/4 of the market value. Okay, and the firm not captured is not very, it's quite thinly traded and relatively small. Okay, so from this, so as I said, I will provide a lot of data, a lot of facts. Okay, so I think it's a value for us to understand how far we have come along. So for example, if you look at, so this is the, let's go back. So it's from since the millennium. Okay, so from 2000 all the way to 2021, and we are still updating the data. Okay, so at the beginning of the 2000, there were 9.2 female directors on the board, and the most recent snapshot is 26.2. So that's a very steep rise. And BoardX also covers some European firms that checked Europe in terms of board gender diversity is making even higher progress than the US. And we also look at racial and ethnic diversity. So AAPI is Asian and Pacific Islands. So if you look at Asians from 6.6 to 11, Black is from 1.6 to 4, and Hispanics 1.4 to 7.2. Okay, now this is made possible because in most of the disclosure, there's no, especially in the past, there's no disclosure of race. So of course, if you see a name like Wei Jiang, you know I'm Asian, but a lot of other names is not immediately obvious. Now, what helps us is that in the ISS and Aquila database, we have about 25% of the directors have self-disclosed racial information. So in the age of machine learning, you can train an algorithm based on the 25% of information you can impute on the 75%. So you train the algorithm as if you don't know the 25%. Train such that you have perfect prediction on the 25%. Then you say, okay, this algorithm is good, then I can impute the rest of 75%. So this is the approach we took. And there are a few off-the-shelf algorithms, like ethnic color is pre-trained based on the U.S. Census data. Okay, deepface. Sometimes, most of the time, these board members, they're all, celebrity type of people. So they have photos. So we can also train the Google deepface to train based on image. Okay, so in the end, we train so that we achieve 93% accuracy on the sample we have data. Then we apply to the out of sample. Okay, We also measure experience diversity, is that we use a BERT. BERT is a machine learning algorithm developed by Google, used off the shelf. You just put the two resumes of two directors and tell BERT say how similar they are. BERT will spit out between 0 and 1. 1 is the identical, 0 is totally different. Okay? So we can have pairwise similarity. Now, we allocate all the skills into this leadership, law, regulation, government, marketing, finance, accounting, operation, technology, and academics. And we allow each person to capture the top 2 skills because all our board members are incredibly competent and versatile. If you just catch the keywords, everybody is a Joe of all trades. So you have to cap them in the top 2, okay? And we find over half the finance accounting is the top skill followed by the leadership. Okay, so the resume similarity is about half. So if you just take a random pair of 2 directors, they overlap half. That's how you interpret. Okay, and the skill average diversity measure is 0.62, meaning, so diversity is 1 minus similarity. So meaning if you have 2 randomly picked pair of directors, they have 40% skill overlap and 60% complement. Okay, that seemed to be good. In the board literature, there is a literature called a Rolodex effect, meaning if you went to the same place, the country club, the school, the university dorm, you're more likely to appoint each other on the same board. Now, I think this is very intuitive to think about the 2 organizers, Per and Bo, and 2 keynote speakers, Luigi and I. We have a common link called University of Chicago. So in the US, a few firms, especially McKinsey, GE, and Goldman Sachs, these 3 firms have produced a large army of corporate senior executives. There's so many of them, they call these people alums. So they will heard about, oh, you are McKinsey alum, you are a Goldman Sachs alum, because they produce so many leaders in the government as well as for the corporations. And people from one of these institutions tend to carry certain signature style, like they look very GE or they look very, very Goldman, so that that is also a dimension of board diversity. All your boards are Goldman alums or GE alums. Okay? So we measure institutional diversity, just say, look at everybody, I count every single institution you have ever been. Okay? And take a random pair, see whether the 2 of you were ever overlapping in any institution. So this is only doable when you have a very detailed bio of all the directors. And the average, the average diversity is 0.8. What does that mean? Meaning, if you take a random pair of directors, with 20% of the probability they will once overlap in some. So Luigi and I would be that 20% because we overlap at University of Chicago. So that's how it's calculated. Now, is 20% high or low? It's up to your interpretation. Okay, so I think it's pretty high, meaning with 20% probability, any 2 pair of directors will overlap in some institution. Okay, so there is a lot of institutional selection. Now, how about, yes?
Are you talking about picking 2 random board members from the same board? Or 2
from the same board. From the same board, yeah. So you have to have the detailed resume to code that.
If you pick 2 random board members from whatever board, do you know what the overlap is?
That's an interesting thing. We can do that as well. But that's the same. So you're just saying cross. It could be just the same number of people, same group of people become board members everywhere. That's a very interesting thing. So we can look at within board versus cross board. We can do that. Now we can also look at the education diversity because certain boards follow military academies. Some boards are all from Ivy. Okay, so this is the type of education, and the average value is basically, if you take a random pair of directors with 50% of probability they graduate from the same type of education, not the same university, but same type. They all from Ivy, or they're from state, flagship state business school, a flagship state school, or they from military academy. Those are the categories. Okay, now I think both measures you would think, as diverse as our boards have become, it remains a small world. It's still about whom you know, where you have been. So it's like who we are, what we do, etc. And there are a lot of past dependence along the way. Okay. The next one is two measures that's directly related to the view. Now, I think there's a huge generational gap in terms of view. I couldn't understand my kids, so I really attribute it to the age. Okay, so there's also academic research show that among the CEOs, if they belong to different cohort, they have very different styles of management. Okay, now finally, a key thing that we introduced to the board research is their political diversity. Now, I really want to measure people's values and views, as Luigi pointed out, but there's not an easy way to really measure values. So I have to reduce it to something that's simple and measurable. Okay? Now, given that in the US we are entering an age of extreme political polarization, okay? Now, we thought the party-leaning stance, you don't need to be a member of the party, but the party-leaning stance could be a powerful proxy for people's value. Okay, so we measure political stance based on the Federal Election Commission. So this is an independent agency of the government that track political contribution. Okay, so it could be $100 contribution to $1 million contribution, any amount. Okay, so this is an agency exists to promote transparency of political contribution. So it's an unbiased, unselected sample. Okay, so we match the board members to their political contribution, whether they contribute to a Democratic affiliated political committee or the Republican affiliated political committee. The FEC defined the committee which side it leaned towards. Okay, and we only look at the last 10 years. So no, we allow people to change every 10 years. So it's a moving window of last 10 years, and the HHI index is 0.46. So on the board, again, it's about half of time you overlap and half time you polarize. Okay, so I think this is the first time someone can present a table like this when you have all the diversity measure at one place. And we can, again, you can form your own view whether making progress, not making progress, it's high enough, not high enough. Now, the two graphs at the bottom, okay, are the gender diversity and racial diversity. So the single most one with the steepest increase, especially the most recent years, gender diversity. Just a substantial number of women made to the board seats is both dramatic and also very recent. And also diversity, racial diversity. And if we were expand, we already have partial data, to one more year, racial diversity would double. Okay, because after the murder of Freud in the U.S., this outrage of racial inequity, and between 2021 2022, a lot more people of color were appointed on the board. Now, if you look at everything else, like age diversity, so in the first few years, age diversity decreased because the board members are there forever, okay, and they're just getting old, okay. But then at a certain time, young people start to join the board and age diversity reverted. But everything else, skill diversity, experience diversity, educational diversity, everything's kind of a little bit downtrend, okay? So there was a Wall Street Journal article, say when a board was very eager to appoint a woman, appoint a racial minority to the board, they immediately go to their Harvard alum network and invite one. So when you invite those people on the board, look more diverse, but you actually make it educational diversity, less diverse. Okay, so this is the correlation table. Okay, I highlight if a correlation coefficient is more than 0.5%, that's kind of marginally significant. And you can see that experience diversity is linked to skill and institution, but actually have a negative correlation with racial. So just show, when they try to appoint a racial minority director, they tend to do it from their own social circle. Okay, so this is a, if you want to, I put the table there so you can actually see the number, but the explanations on the top is just it's a verbal explanation about what this table is. Here we are looking at all the directors when they join the company, and see whether they delta, the triangles deltas, do they contribute more to the diversity? If it's a positive, meaning adding this director make the board more diverse along that specific dimension. Okay, so if you look at column 2 to 6, so column 1, 0, meaning you can make the board more diverse demographically, but then you're not making them more politically more diverse or less diverse. So the demographic diversity on political stance is neutral, but something that I will dig into deeper later on. From column 2 to 6, okay, meaning when you have gender and racial minority directors, these are new directors, you actually do make the board more diverse in terms of experience, in terms of skill, and in terms of the age. But you're actually making the education diversity less. So this is the effect many people notice from anecdotes. Okay, so it's the same thing. There's the big three, the large institutional investors are imposing pressure on you. There's NASDAQ rules. Okay, you have 6 more months to comply. You need a woman, you need a racial minority. What do? You go to the alum network. Okay, so it is showing up in this empirical results. But these alums do seem to study different major, work in a different industry line, but they're somehow from your educational network. Okay, so this is what we found. Now, I view this as a positive news, meaning when firms are mostly under pressure to expand their demographic diversity, but it seems when they do this, they're also expanding diversity along other dimensions that are directly relevant for decision making. So I personally view this is good news. Now, this is something we find that is to our surprise. Okay, so the previous table we find, adding minority is a neutral impact on the board in terms of political divide. But when we divide the boards into the Republican-leaning boards and Democratic-leaning boards, we find a complete asymmetry. A Democratic-leaning boards meaning the incumbents are majority Democratic-leaning. Okay? And the Republican-leaning boards, the incumbent directors are majority Republican-leaning. Okay? So what we find is that when a Republican-leaning board appoint a new director who's from gender or racial minority, they also diversify the political stance. What does it mean? They are inviting Democratic-leaning minorities to join the board. Now, when you look at Democratic-leaning boards, when they appoint new directors that of gender racial minority, they're making their political stance less diverse, meaning they are also appointing minority directors who are Democratic-leaning. So what does it say is that if you're racial or gender minority, okay, if you're Democratic, you're welcome by both boards, and if you're Republican-leaning, you're quite welcome by either board. Okay? So the fact of doing this is that when the US boards are become more diverse in terms of gender ratio, they both become bluer. Okay, so the Republican assigned the color red and Democrats assigned the color blue. So both boards have become bluer. Now, this effect does not seem to be impacted by everything else because everything else, column 2 to 6, the directions are identical to the previous result. So both boards, when they have gender and racial minority, they're having more diverse skills, more diverse age, more diverse experience, etc., except that this political diversity has the opposite effect. Okay? Now, we can do this from a different angle. Let's just look at what explains the probability that a new director is political minority. Okay? And the focus is on the last few, when we have demographic attributes multiplied by another variable called the current is demographic majority. So basically, if you're a female and if you join a currently demographic majority board, you're far less likely to be a political minority, meaning you're also democratic. Okay? And these coefficients are very big. Now, this is potentially, a provoking finding. That's why we check our codes again and again to make sure, they are correct. Okay. So what does it say? Is that both type of boards are more likely to emit new directors who are demographic minority, and then such a diversity movement would lead both boards to be bluer. Now, when we first tell people, say, hey, so when we find this, we ask colleagues, like, we find this, do you think it's surprising? What do you think it is? Now, one hypothesis people point out is that in the US, women and minority, in the population, they just vote more for demographic parties. Not just in the recent years, but historical. So that could be a supply issue. If you want to appoint women and racial minority, they're naturally supporting Democrats. Okay, so that is true. However, that hypothesis is not true among executives. So even though it's true for the general population, they are not true among executives. Okay? Why do we emphasize executives? Because 75% of board members are corporate executives. Okay? And so we track the corporate executives' political leaning. Okay? So this is a percentage that they support Democrats. So if you look at all executives, they're still more Republican leaning. That's a historical alignment. Okay? Now, if you look at executives who are not white male, so all executives excluding white male, they're about 50-50. Okay? So among women and racial minority, Republican and Democrat leaning people, actually it's a fair toss, even though the whole population is not this. Okay? Because the political stance also impacted by education, wealth, and profession, etc. So basically the supply is even. You can pick whom you want. There's equal supply of either type. Okay? So let's just look at whether the board appointment respond to local supply of talents. Okay? So this one, we look at the red state and the blue state. The red state is rep, and the blue state is Dem. And this is time varying based on the last 4 years of presidential election cycle. Certain states never move, but the swing states change from 4 years to 4 years. Okay? So if you are a red state, if you're red firm in red state, you have a lot of supply to appoint directors share your view. Now, if you are red firm in the blue state, you probably don't have that supply of executives share your view, and vice versa. So what we find out is that it's not impacted by supply. Okay? Now, the red firm always try to recruit minority directors from the opposite political spectrum, regardless whether in a red state or blue state. And the blue firms tend to recruit minority directors that share their political view, whether they're in the red state or blue state. They don't seem to respond to the local supply of talent. Some firms, the big firms, the Apple, they're directors from all states. So the state level supply is not a big deal, but a lot of mid-cap or small-cap firms, their directors are pretty within commuting distance. So the local supply should play a role. Okay. Now the next one is just say, do these diverse directors? Because if I'm the only say progressive director in a conservative board, do I get to stay? Or after 1 year, I say, I don't fit in, I will leave, right? And here we actually show that political stance does not contribute to abnormal departure. Seems so if you're a political minority, it's okay. You're not more likely to depart than someone who fit in the general political spectrum. And we check the departure into you leave for the better position or worse position. So we think if you leave for better position meaning you leave for a board that's at least 25% larger in market cap. You leave for lesser position, you're leaving for a board that is at least 25 lower in market cap. Okay? So here we show very clear that women and black directors, they are significantly less likely to depart for worse positions. So the number 1 is neutral, meaning 100%. So number 0.15 meaning 15% of the neutral probability. And 1.226 meaning 23% above the neutral probability. Okay? So women and black directors are more likely to jump to a bigger boat and far less likely to go to a smaller company, meaning they're in high demand. Okay? And also, if you are a political minority, you're no more likely to depart. Okay? Meaning you don't quite fit in. So what does it show? That once you're there, it's okay. But it's about how to make it to be there. It is the barrier. Okay? Okay, so I think I have 1 minute left, and this is my last table. Doesn't matter. Okay? It's very, very difficult to measure whether boards matter. Now, CEO, we can see a new CEO is appointed, the stock market went up 8%. If you look at a new board member to be appointed, the stock market reactions just overwhelmed by whatever noise that is there. But there's some situation that you do see something, sort of COVID. Okay, so this is during the month and a half when COVID erupted. And we look at the market response, the stock market return that we adjusted for the size, market to book, momentum, liquidity, because the event is a liquidity event, so very important just for liquidity impact. So we look at excess return of the stock of individual firms and go against this diversity. And what is striking is that the board with skill and experience, diversity performs significantly better after adjusted for the risk. Okay? And everything else is neutral except racial diversity, because COVID was also coincide with a racial reckoning moment. So the board that is racially diverse also have marginal significant positive result. Okay? And to see that the data actually make intuitive sense, we also look at technological skill, and it's significant. Meaning, if you have the company has more technology expertise on the board, knowing how to deal with work from home, it's also better. Okay? Now, we don't want to say the other diversity does not matter. Just the COVID shock per se show that skill diversity matters. Okay? And a different shock could show other diversity could matter. Okay? So this is a case actually show board diversity matters in those strong and identifying moments, and different moments could advocate for different type of diversity. Okay, so I think I just conclude in time. So it's a lot of new data, and to show a diverse list of facts about diversity. That's the whole view of the thing. Okay, and what we show is that I think the most striking point is probably this political alignment that Democratic-leaning boards want more homogeneous political viewpoint, and Republican-leaning boards seems, they probably don't care. That's why, they're more likely to do either. But the crisis moment do underscore the importance of diversity of boards. So, Ann here, look forward to your feedback. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wei. I would like to welcome up the panelists, Ann, Wilhelm, Catharina. While they come up, let me ask you a question, Wei. So you didn't talk much about what drives the board composition until a little bit at the end here.
Yeah.
What kind of owners, what kind of industries? Is that something that's coming that we can look forward to down the line?
Well, yeah, so I think this is a first step, just kind of get the data going and present some general statistics to see where things are going. But we very much to conduct further and more research into what's driving what and how this is motivated or decided by the ownership structure or certain episodic movement at the general societal level.
Yeah. Great, fantastic. Okay, so the panelists, apart from Wei, are from my right to my left. Ann Grevelius, who is a very experienced finance professional, entrepreneur in fintech, and board member in many companies in Sweden and abroad. Wilhelm Mohn, who I thought was corporate governance responsible, but is, I think, global active ownership head.
We rebranded, but it's still the same. Yeah.
At the oil fund, it's still the oil fund.
Yeah.
That's not the name.
Not the name. Not
Yeah.
the name.
One of the world's largest asset managers. And Catharina Belfrage Sahlstrand is head of sustainability and climate at Handelsbanken, still Handelsbanken,
Yes. Last time I checked.
and a lawyer by training, so also an expert in legal matters. I thought we'd spend a couple of minutes with each of you, maybe begin with you, Wilhelm. It said in the blurb about you that there are 9,000 companies in your portfolio.
Yeah, just under that now, but yeah.
So that's perfect from the academic point of view of diversifying away idiosyncratic risk. You went all the way.
We are more or less, yeah.
But you cannot possibly, or can you possibly have a firm opinion about what should happen in all these 9,000 companies and sit on all the boards and be engaged? Or how do you sort that gigantic problem out?
Yeah, thank you, Anders. You need to sort it out. That's you can't sit on all the boards, but you need to, you still have an interest and a role to play. So what we try to do, we start from this sort of points of principle that we kind of skirted around this morning as well. There's two things. It's really the principal agent problem. How do you make sure that the board works for you and is aligned with your long-term interests as much as you can? And also, because we are so long-term and diversified, how do you think about the externalities and those things that actually matter in the very long term, environmental, social, and other aspects. And then building some principles around that, we try to implement it through three means, really. One is market change. So supporting better standards and policies around the world, because that is really first best for us, because essentially you kind of then create a dynamic that does the work for you. And then you do it through ownership engagement, so meeting companies, prioritizing on maybe how much you own, the topics and so on, thinking about the really big issues. So, for example, have you incentivized management and other aspects of board accountability, minority shareholder rights, and so on. And then ultimately you have all the voting. So you do vote on these things. We have the right to vote, and you have to have principles for that as well. And there again, we start with principles, and we try not to second guess, not to make it too detailed or prescriptive, being very clear on the board accountability, but build the ability to move in and vote against if we see sort of very big deviations from our principles, or where we have portfolio managers. We have a lot of them in-house that actually know the companies very well. So it's imperfect, but the ambition is to go from the broad to sort of top down and bottom up.
And you have shares of companies in so many different jurisdictions where the rules are different and the conventions and culture is different. How do you deal with that? Again,
we find a lot of support in the global principles. Most shares still, there are OECD guidelines for principles for good corporate governance or responsible business conduct, or there is an emerging, a lot of understanding around long-term sustainability problems, climate risk, how it applies. So I think it's sort of at the broad level of principle is not a problem, but then there are kind of two things you need to be aware of. Good practices in markets that go beyond the principles. You don't want to upset that. And markets or companies where it's more lagging, and how can you try and motivate gradual change. So for good practice, we try to identify it and make sure that we have a nuanced enough approach to adjust for it. And for those that are more lagging, we go for more gradual implementation towards what we believe is the good at a minimum level, essentially. So, yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Then, Catharina, tell us a little bit about how Handelsbanken thinks about ownership and boards. You work with sustainability, obviously that's a big part of the question, and maybe other dimensions as well.
Yes, and perhaps just cutting straight to that chase, yes, we do see this as part of the wider ESG agenda and how to work with the board representation with the corporation's ESG agenda. And well, similarly as to what William just described, I mean, the procedures are the same. We're not as large a institutional investor, obviously, but The nomination committee, when it comes to this particular, the topic of the day of diversity, is how we work with the sort of the board composition, based on the conviction that we've talked about many times today, obviously, that is a way to ensure an efficient board composition and value creation and lower the risks and so on. So we sit on, just below 70 or so nomination committees. The basic aim, obviously, is to put together that efficient board on various dimensions, obviously, and diversity in the broadest possible sense of the word. But then again, all of those dimensions don't break down into KPIs that we can measure. So there is a certain tilt towards trying to secure a evenly distributed gender composition on those boards of directors. So that is one of the focus areas, obviously. And well, fun fact, I guess, because representation is important then for making that diversity onto those board of directors, is that 75% or so of Handelsbanken Fonder's representatives onto those nominational committees are women themselves. Because we think that ideally, looking at a board as a whole, ideally being a machinery of sorts, so we try not to focus too much on the individual representatives, but it's, that the board, both in terms of size and age and everything else with the demographic diversity, that we want that to work. Ideally, we find that if the composition of the short list of candidates is based on an outdated Rolodex, that's just simply a shame. So a lot of the work has to do with making sure that the composition of the list of candidates brings out an ample or suitable amount of candidates from both sexes, is the underrepresented sex. And then, but it comes down to all of the perspectives, obviously, of diversity. So we work very much through the short list of candidates, and then at the end of the day, it's up to the nomination committee to decide. But the short list is perhaps the first hurdle to diversity when it comes to board representation.
And who serves on the nomination committee? Is that an employee of the bank, or do you have a pool of external people you recommend? How does that work?
There's a bit of both.
Yeah.
We would have, but then we would bump into some insider information at times, so we try not to have one of the fund managers themselves. We have a number of external candidates that we have represent us on those nominational committees.
So you have a pool of potential nomination committee members, a pool of potential board members. It's a big thing to keep going. Are you primarily focused on Sweden, even though you have funds that invest abroad?
Absolutely. So there is a certain activity that is larger in the Nordics, although our fund company does have a global remit and plenty of 112 funds or so spread over the world. So,
and on that one dimension that is relatively easily measurable and quite visible, which is the gender composition of boards, how are things going?
You would think that I would have a updated sort of figure in my head.
But an opinion?
And I will never leave home without that ever again. But so we'll roughly, we would say that voting on all of these board and the nominational committees, that there has been over the last few years some an increase, and I don't have that figure with me.
No, but improving?
Slowly. Intuitively, and also what we do measure, it is improving slowly, to the extent that our corporate governance head with Handelsbanken Fonder says that this is not as large an issue anymore, and that for that reason not as interesting when it comes to just the gender composition. They don't bump into those typical objections anymore when looking for that list of candidates, that there simply aren't enough women with the relevant experience from operational practices that we can populate this list with. So more and more turning into just a normal assessment of that list, and they're getting their requests across with ease compared to just a couple of years ago.
Okay, good. And so I thought it'd be interesting to hear what you think of Wei's results about the different kinds of diversity, and I guess Wei's general thesis that all these non-obvious dimensions also matter. Is that something that resonates with you in your experience?
Absolutely. And first of all, big thanks. Very interesting research and great presentation as well. And I think this is really what we lack. because we tend to focus so much on the demographics, the easy ones, and then we think we're done because we have a 50-50 gender composition of a board, and that may be very, very wrong. I mean, what do we even, I mean, how do we define a gender, I mean, or specifics? Is it like all the men in this room is not interested in sustainability and equal terms for your employees? Of course not. And I must also say that from my experience, I think the toughest, most male-ish, if we may say so, generalize a bit, chairman that I have seen was a chairwoman, and her hobbies were golf, sailing, and hunting. And I have had another chairman that was in the opposite direction, a man, tall, big, very male-ish from that kind of view, but one of his hobbies were knitting. So I think are we doing things, trying to make things a little bit too easy, and also that we have to move beyond visibility and measurable metrics when it comes to really recruiting from a diverse perspective.
And on a board, can you give an example of how it would matter in the work of a board, in the meetings and big decisions, to have these other kinds of diversity?
We can take an example. I was not on the board, but an advisory board in a fund management company that were presenting to the board their strategy on communication and marketing. And the whole presentation was kind of full with the things and the words we really connect to the financial business and the financial industry. So it was about return and risk and performance and benchmark and a lot of different metrics, and it was like IRRs, and it was active share, and it was everything you can connect with asset management. And there was a question raised in this room. Who's the target group, and who is actually going to invest in this fund? And the management team and the founders, they were so, this is for everyone. This is for young, old, women, men. This is for everyone. And then an obvious question: what's the proportion of this target group will actually understand anything of what you're saying here? So I think that in tweaking it and in adding other perspectives in this room, both from maybe a gender perspective, but also from a kind of knowledge perspective, it was very valuable to add that, okay, we have to explain this in another way. It would be very hard to attract women if we generalize again, but I mean also a big part of that target group will not understand the message. I think and that was strategy on communication and marketing. So I think that's one example where it's very obvious that you could actually add value, and it could have gone wrong.
Great. Wait, does this resonate with is that the sort of perspective you had when you started this project?
Sure, and I think I appreciate your feedback about especially focusing on this less obvious dimension of diversity. But actually, if you allow, I actually have a question for these people. I think one recent drive in board diversity is that every episode requires firms to acquire certain expertise on the board, right? So the board needs a compliance expert. The board needs a sustainability expert. The board suddenly needs a cybersecurity expert. The board needs an AI expert, right? So I call this a singleton Noah's Ark, like a Noah's Ark of two of everything. Now the board, we need one of everything, right? So on the paper, we measure very well on skill diversity, but each time when the board recruits these specialists and they say, oh, now we don't have women, so the cybersecurity expert also needs to be a woman. So you're focusing on a pool of female cybersecurity experts, a very narrow pool, rather to say, hey, let's recruit the best athlete. So I just a question for you: when you face this, board saying they need expert on something that's currently very important or is currently a popular keyword, how do you balance that need with a long-term goal of having a board that's coherent and diverse?
Can I have a go at that?
Yeah.
Well, we completely agree.
Yeah.
And in Handelsbanken Fonder, we sort of discussed this particular problem because ticking just one box is obviously going to lead to that particular outcome, that you might have a person on that board which is potentially also a bit marginalized. So that's a person that doesn't have the same knowledge of just board work or operational work on a listed company or whatnot. So ticking at least two boxes in terms of we're looking for a specific competency here would be one thing. The other one being, and I just venture an idea, that apart from the diversity itself, the board as a whole, working as that well-oiled machinery is the second aspect, without which, I mean, there's no point in having the diversity itself if you don't have the culture on that board to bring that diversity out to the benefit of the tactical and strategic decisions that board needs to be making. So if these two are KPIs, then perhaps the second KPI is how well is that chairperson managing bringing the diversity out into the actual board work, which was why your slide at the end on the actual performance of the company, together with that diversity was so interesting. But yes, ticking just one box is definitely a one-way street to having a less well-functioning board together.
And I think that a problem again because it's not so easily measured. How does the group and the board? I mean, how does it actually work?
Yeah.
What is the culture? Is everyone kind of getting listened to? How are the chairmen actually managing the room? And that's a challenge. Even though we try to, in nomination boards and the boards, we try to evaluate this regularly. But I mean, it's not so easy to find a specific metrics on it.
Right.
But I think interesting is that I think that every board also has to define that perhaps we do not need a cybersecurity expert in the board. We need that expertise in the organization. So you have to probably decide what is strategic, what has to be in the board, and that is more like decision power, leadership, experience, general experience, and then you have to have a second layer. They don't have to be on the board, but you have to have really good people on all these different, perhaps more like specific experiences and not skills.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's clearly very nuanced. Right? So it needs to work for the specific board, and the more interesting discussion is what works for the board and how do you think about and how collectively do you have the skills. But we still think, so that's why we wouldn't ever, we don't take an approach to voting where we vote against every single little tick. But for example, something like gender, 50%, if there's absolutely no gender balance, or sort of the nomination process doesn't in any way kind of reflect the world, then there is more reason to question it and also more reason to vote against. But yeah, you soon run into barriers. If you want it all to be represented all the time, you can either you can't observe it and you can't implement it.
Great. We have time for questions and comments from the audience. Maybe I think we have pretty significant board experience in the room that we could offer. Yes, please. Do you want to use your microphone on your right? Thank you.
We don't invest in Norway, so that's the quick answer to that one. No, but I think you have to, when we can and when we part, where we have a significant holding or a long-term relation with the company, we speak to the board, or we might even be on nomination committee in Sweden, then that is definitely part of the discussion, how does this process ensure that it reflects society. At the same time, it's quite a dynamic thing, and it's hard to probably pin down, and maybe there is still a sort of generational aspect here, but you would want to see it over time. From the UK, where I'm based, and where we have a bigger part of our investments, I think you're starting to see it.
There are regulations
yes.
and recommendations
there's
already. There is a framework about
right.
it, as well as recommendations in the US. I think it's a very good question, Sophie, and also coming back to, we do measure what is easy to measure, and we are now so familiar with gender, and we also know that we're good at that here up in the Nordics and in Sweden. So now we're done with that, but I mean, of course, we have to move on into other. And I do think again, that a lot of this also non-demographic aspects has to be developed. I think we need tools for this.
In fact, the more measurable dimensions you try to hit, the more important this problem becomes that you mentioned, to make sure that the board works, that these are skilled people, that you're not just ticking boxes. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Wilhelm, you wanted to?
No,
Okay.
It's very good points.
Great. Yeah, a question in the back with the white shirt, please.
When the first...
Can you use your microphone?
Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you.
For us, it's something we raise with the company. It's a matter of human capital management. How do you make sure that you have the incentives and the practices and the culture that maximizes the pool? And then you expect to see some data on it. And yeah, in some markets there is much reporting on it. In some markets it's not, and it can come down to sort of legal position in both ways. Some markets would find it sort of very discriminatory to ask all these questions and report on it. So it's quite nuanced, but you'd expect the company to be able to tell you, and you'd like to see sort of a considered approach. Sorry, I think you were about to.
Well, I don't have anything super original to add, but I mean, from Handelsbanken Fonder's perspective, we would typically hear that argument the other way around. Namely, it's very difficult to get the representation we would like on the board level because there are simply not enough women on the operational level. Having said that, obviously, a company is not the sort of the growing bed for its own board of directors. So this is more of something that we foster for society, for each other's board of directors, so to speak. But sometimes we just hear that argument flipped around. So first we need to see the diversity on the employee level, and once that has happened, it is going to be super easy to populate the board level seats. And doing it the other way around can, for some, be a bit more construed, and for that reason, perhaps less of an issue when you look at what the diversity looks like, at least in Sweden, on the university level, of people actually exiting university and going into the corporate world.
Mm.
Why don't you start?
I am in the lucky position that we only have all the beneficiaries are all the Norwegians, and it's governed through a mandate from the Ministry of Finance, who are our formal owners, and there are debates in Parliament every year on it. There's a finance committee that has a couple of days dedicated to it. We report back. And
I think you're getting off very lightly.
I think we are getting off very lightly, but I think it's also kind of that is the. Maybe the Ministry of Finance should consider an assembly rather than an expert group next time, but that's how it's done.
And for us, the notion of bringing diversity into the board representation then comes from the idea that would make good business sense, because it would be the essence of at least the G in the ESG to have a diverse board representation. And every once in a while, we also surface some really good research showing that there is a correlation also between the diversity and the performance of the company. So coming from that, we haven't had any large surveys among our customers actually raising hands if they think that's a good idea. So that's part of the management that we do on their behalf.
Well, I think that you have to start there. If it is a truly international global company, then that company obviously needs a diverse board that kind of mirrors the complexity of the whole business. So I think there it becomes very important. Then, of course, it always adds aspects even to a company which is perhaps only has business in Sweden or the Nordics. It could definitely be an important kind of add-on to a board.
And from our perspective, we agree. I zoomed in very quickly today on the gender aspect. I mean, looking at our guidelines for our nominational committees, there are various aspects, socioeconomic and so on, and age and various different things that we try to, sometimes we try to flesh that out through interviews, and there are a few qualitative assessments that we do through these nominational committees that are not as easily boiled down into KPIs on a spreadsheet, but we find enormously important based on, again, what that company needs at that particular point in time, obviously.
In countries with labor representation like Sweden and Germany, the labor representatives tend to be home country only, overwhelmingly. Maybe coming out of a union that's national in charter. And so the employees in Bangladesh and Brazil are excluded by construction. So that's definitely a dimension that's missing in these companies potentially. Yeah.
Sure. So we do discover when a diverse director was initially appointed to the board, it is a 0.8% increase the board size, meaning typically it is a board expansion. However, it tends to be offset very quickly in the next 2 years by a board member departure. So if you look at the longer history, the average board size barely increased by one person, like slightly less than person. So in the long history, there's not a significant expansion of board size because I think a lot of literature show, the large boards don't function as well. But at the moment, when a diverse director is appointed, it's more likely to be a net expansion at the moment relative to a non-diverse director. Yeah.
I have a question for Wei as well. May I?
Go ahead.
Oh,
Yeah.
it would be so interesting, based on what you showed us a couple of minutes ago, that certain proxies for diversity does create, in certain instances, more diversity, but in other instances it doesn't. That there would be a model of sorts to train, so that this can be used as a bespoke model for boards of directors. So based on the setup of the board that you have today, this is the particular dimension of diversity you should be looking for. Is that, a part of, together with the size aspect, I mean, the vast amounts of data going into your research would make for a big pool of bespoke.
I completely agree. I think that's a very, very promising direction to pursue, is to basically point out a subtle dimension of lack of diversity during the process of diversifying the boards. I think that is a very key issue we want to pursue more.
You should start a company. Offers this to the executive search firms and to everyone that is recruiting. Yeah, I mean, you miss a lot of tools today. So then
That's
you
great
end
to
up
know.
in this easy measure.
That's great to know.
Great. No, she has the right paper. She does.
And I think that gentleman raised his hand many times. Yes. Yeah, so I do find that's a very, very intriguing finding. It's not something I anticipated before we went into the data. And we actually don't know why this happens. So there's one hypothesis that the current board actively investigate the new candidate political stance and make a decision. I'm not sure that is the reality. Another reality is that you interview the candidates. And when candidates speak, I think it's actually, in today's world, it's actually quite difficult to hide what their leaning stance is. So it is what we find is that the democratic majority boards tend to find the candidates talk in their language to be more appealing, and they have that selectivity, while the Republican boards don't seem to care. It's not like they like one or the other, but they will take either. So that's a relative asymmetry there. Now, when I talk to colleagues and other people, they also find it's not obvious, like, do you want people, they find it's very painful to live with people with very different political views. So I don't know, ever since the last 4 presidential election cycle in the US, there are far more divorce relative to opposing political view than before. Like before, you don't care whom you marry, but today you do care. It seems like it's impossible to live with a person who holds such polarized view. So would such a board function well, or do you deliberately want to make people uncomfortable because this is better to serve your wide stakeholders and make robust decisions? So I certainly hear very, very different views, but I don't think the boards were looking at, hey, which committee you contribute to decide on your candidacy, but it's when people interview or talk, they find out whom they feel more comfortable to work with, and that's where the asymmetry is. But of course, I'm interested to hear your practice. You know how this actually happened.
It feels like, I mean, it's very different.
Yeah.
US is very different
Very
from
different. Yeah,
Europe
yeah,
and from
yeah.
Sweden. We don't tell anyone what party we vote for. So I think it would be quite sensitive to kind of match recruitment to boards with political views.
Nothing particular to add there. It would be easier, I guess, to try to seek out values, the underlying values, rather than put a political color onto those. Yeah, so I agree.
I think, I wouldn't to have an opinion on that either, I think. But I think what is important, though, is from the corporate's point of view, and like we heard this morning, is the transparency around how the company is involved in lobbying or political decision making and so on. So I think that's something we think is very important. The political stances of the board members is not something we've looked at.
I'm trying to figure out what the profile of the... Yeah, 1 second. I'm trying to figure out what the profile of the boards in Sweden might be politically. I don't even know. I would have a hunch, but I don't know. I serve on the board of the concert hall, which is appointed by the regional parliament, so I do know everybody except me, which party they represent. It's not representative at any given time, but on average over time, both the red and the blue parties appoint half the board members.
Yeah, one thing I also mentioned earlier, I think each board should not be expected as to be a singleton Noah's Ark, one of each, because then you're not really pick the most qualified, the best people from the widest possible pool. Now I also feel at the grade level, I think just as a person, regardless of your demographic characteristics or your background, as long as you are skillful, you have the right value, you should be able to ascend to be a senior executive or board director. So it's almost like across the board, we want diversity, but we should not require the same maximum diversity at a given unit. But each person, each member should have roughly the same opportunity to make it somewhere into the board. So I think there should also be measured at a broader perspective rather than a single board. Because I think by industry characteristics, certain industry just have more women on the boards, actually a majority women on the boards, certain industry, right? But should we have the same mandated quota for every single firm? I think that's not necessary. But we also need to have overall auditing system or tracking system to see whether we are hitting at the representative level as a whole.
Completely agree.
Yeah.
Great. I think that's it. That concludes the first day of the conference. Thank you very much, everybody.